Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Caesar's Revenge. So this is kind of what it sounds like in terms of plot. You are Julius Caesar. After you've been assassinated, you've come back, and you're not very happy with the senators, and pretty much the entire game is based around you going through ancient Rome and killing all the senators that stabbed you. And in fact, that's how you end every level. Instead of like an end level button or a gate or something, there's a senator at the end that you've got to walk up to and smack. So this is technically in the old school shooter vein, except it's not really a shooter because you're in ancient Rome, so most of your weapons are melee weapons. There are some projectile weapons, but they're a lot more limited. You don't have a lot of ammo for them in most levels, and also they're not guns, so they're a lot slower. Things like a bow or a sling are not anywhere near as fast as like a pistol or a shotgun, so you're going to be doing a lot of melee combat in this game. In terms of overall mechanics, it's pretty simple, deliberately so. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles or a lot of fancy features. It is definitely very old school. You have simple movement that is very fast. You're really fast on your feet. Caesar's been practicing for the marathon. And you also don't have a jump, so there's no place that would require you to do any sort of jumping. And in fact, usually edges have walls and stuff around them, so you can't fall off of stuff anyway. The levels will start out as relatively bite-sized, but will get larger and more complex as you go through the acts. There are 3 acts in the game, each having like 10 or 11-ish levels, so there's quite a few levels actually to go through. There's a lot here. And it's also obviously geared towards completing very quickly once you're used to the levels, because there are par times for each of the levels, Doom style, and they are not generous. The overall pars are really, really quick. You would have to play these levels over and over again in order to get familiar enough with them to be able to complete them in that kind of time, but it's cool that it's there for people that want to do more of a speedrunning kind of thing once they're used to the layouts. Visually, the game is kind of dark and dismal, but I mean that in a good way. Like, it's clearly meant to be sort of foggy and dark and a little bit muddy, and I think it actually looks pretty good for a game of this type, mostly because of the textures and stuff having a lot of character to them. The weapon models that are close to the screen are interestingly high resolution and detailed compared to everything else, which I think makes sense. If you're going to make one part of the game be very, very detailed, the thing that's right in front of your face all the time would be the thing to choose. And a lot of the sort of city or ruin areas with lots of stone and buildings and palaces and all sorts of stuff like that, they look really good, I think. I really enjoy the way that those look. The aqueduct level, for some reason, to me was particularly impressive. I'm not entirely sure what it was, but I really liked the way that level looked. It was also a brutal level. It was very difficult, but it was, I think, the combination of the pretty sort of nature surrounding you and then this sort of nice stonework and buildings and stuff on this straight line aqueduct. It was just a really cool level with some juxtaposition of the nature look and the more sort of civilized stonework look. And all of this mechanical simplicity lends itself really well to a game of this style. It means that there aren't really any extraneous mechanics or anything. I enjoy really complex shooters and stuff, but it's also nice sometimes to see one that is kind of back to basics and is doing everything it can with a much more simple set of ideas. The biggest thing that I was personally interested in when I saw the game was the map design, because there are a lot of different ways to design old school shooter maps that are really fun and enjoyable, but if you're in a game where you're not really a shooter and instead almost everything is melee combat focused, that's going to change how you design your maps really drastically. And I think they've done some pretty neat stuff here to facilitate that. So for one thing, you actually pistol start every map in this game, by which I mean you start with no weapons. You don't carry over your weapons from previous maps at all. This is kind of neat, actually, because it allows the developers to ensure what exact weapons you have in every map, because it's not about what you brought from before, it's about what that particular map gives you. So they have really strict control over what you can find. It also means that you're meant to expend all of the resources you can in that one map, because you can't save it for later, so you might as well use it. If you've got a whole bunch of ammo for a bow or something, then there's no point in not using it until the end, because you can't bring it with you anyway, so you may as well actually use it as much as possible. And overall, I think the map design reminds me a lot more of like a sort of Doom 1 or maybe even Blood style of experience, that being a lot more like sort of linear areas with some enemies sprinkled in here and there, mixed with some larger arenas here and there that have more enemies and some secrets and stuff to find aside from those to help you out in the arenas if you find them and all that stuff. Basically something that is kind of the opposite of like the Hexen and Heretic larger open hub style. The maps in this game tend to be quite linear, but they don't feel confined per se, because even though a lot of them are, technically speaking, a straight line, there are, for one, lots of secrets to find, and because of the way the weapons work in this game, the secrets are very, very much worth finding. They can help you out a lot. You know, this is the kind of game where finding a secret or not can be the difference between having a ranged option at all for the entire map. But it's also because of those linear areas are spaced out between larger open areas, not too large, not big hubs, but larger than the sort of hall-like areas in between, with more enemies and more room to maneuver and stuff, and oftentimes more options. This game is really good at giving you options for melee combat, which is admirable, I think, because that's kind of a difficult thing to do, I would think, as a developer, to give the player mostly or entirely melee weapons, depending on the map, but also give them more than one way to deal with a situation, even though pretty much the only thing they can do is walk up to something and poke it. And a lot of this is down to the more open design of the bigger, more brutal arenas. The game does a lot of, here are some enemies in a relatively straight line and kind of a linear corridor between arenas, but then once you get to an arena and it opens up, you have a fair amount of maneuverability and stuff that you can do in order to approach things from different angles, or maybe aggro different groups of enemies at different times, and maybe have a little bit more control over what crowds you have chasing after you at any given time. The open areas are often about exactly that. They're about how you approach each group of enemies. Generally speaking, the bigger arenas will have maybe 2 or 3 groups of enemies apart from each other, and it's up to you to decide how you want to aggro them and when, and how you want to sort of approach each one, because the enemies in this game will kill you really fast. This game is all about aggression. Everything about it incentivizes being as aggressive as possible. For one, both you and the enemies die really fast. You won't really find spongy enemies in this game. Even the most spongy armored enemies still go down in a couple of hits usually. But the same goes for you. You cannot survive more than a few hits. You will die very fast. So when you combine that highly lethal combat where everything happens really quick and it's pretty much over immediately, with the fact that you almost exclusively use melee weapons, this means that your approach to a situation basically determines whether or not you're going to be alive 10 seconds from now before you even start. Each of the enemy types has a specific way to deal with them, not in terms of a weapon you have to use, but in terms of a tactic you need to be aware of when they're around. Rushing up to sling guys before they can sling at you, line of sighting bow guys for a couple of volleys before you go after them, circling around the big great shield dudes and hitting them from the back, trying to hit the smaller shielded dudes from the front right as they attack and stun lock them. Stuff like that you've got to be aware of to make sure that you're dealing with each enemy type as effectively as possible. Another thing that makes it clear that aggression is incentivized in this game is the bloodlust system. So the yellow gauge up there is your health, and the red one beneath that is a bloodlust gauge that builds up as you deal damage to enemies. Once it's full, you go into bloodlust, which gives you ludicrous speed, and very importantly, causes you to heal from damaging enemies. This is extra important because it's pretty much the only way you can heal. There are no health pickups in this game at all. You won't find any monk meal or anything on the ground. You have to do this if you want health back. I don't think it gives you a damage boost. I'm not entirely sure. It kind of doesn't seem like it, but it is really hard to tell because of how quick enemies die anyway. So it might, for all I know, but either way, it's a necessary mechanic because of the healing. There are also some power-ups that you can find around the area, oftentimes in secrets, but not necessarily exclusively. Aside from the obvious weapons and ammo, there's also armor of various kinds, which I like the armor effect because it gives your health gauge chainmail. And armor is extremely useful in this game because it doesn't just reduce damage to you, it completely eliminates damage to your health gauge while you have it. Only the armor will take damage until it's gone. But there's also some other power-ups, like one that triggers Bloodlust automatically as soon as you collect it, or the Karen's Obols, which is like a skull with coins on its eyes, that gives you like an extra life, basically. It revives you on the spot the first time you die. That one in particular is very rare, and as far as I know, it is only ever in secrets. The weapon selection is really fun. Not only are they pretty historically accurate weapons and also just really good looking from a modeling standpoint, they're also really fun to use, which is kind of important. The basic Gladius is sort of like the game's pistol. It's the weapon that you're going to have from the start a lot of the times. Many weapons will start you with one right as soon as you spawn. Other times you'll find it very early, but it tends to be pretty early on that you find one. It's really useful. It's relatively short range, but it has a pretty fast slash and a higher damage but slower stab, and is just a really useful weapon for stun locking lighter enemies and stuff. You've also got stuff like a spear, which does the obvious pokey thing, you know, longer range, nice poke, good damage, but you can also throw the spears. And as weird as this sounds, don't underestimate the power of a thrown spear, because they're basically like railgun shots. They fly in a perfectly straight line and will pierce through large numbers of enemies in a row, so they're extremely useful for dealing with large hordes of weaker enemies. Some of the range weapons are things like the bow, which is really useful because it's super high damage and pinpoint accurate, but a little bit slow to draw. It also has an alt fire that shoots 3 arrows at once, so it's nice for dealing with crowds. You can also find a sling that flings out iron shot, which is deceptively damaging. It does a lot of damage, and it can sort of bounce a little bit too, but it is, of course, slow because you've got to wind it up before you can actually let it go. You'll also very rarely find this thing called the Scorpion, which is like a repeating crossbow. It's super powerful, but of course ammo for it is extremely rare. Really, the weapon itself is extremely rare. You're only going to find it on certain maps, but it's very strong. Another really rare one that's often relegated to secrets, but not always, is the Greek Fire, which I thought was going to act kind of like a napalm sort of idea, like a big area denial weapon, but it's actually more of a grenade. It is just a big burst of damage in a deceptively large area, so be careful when using it. You'll probably only find like one of these on any given map, but it is basically kind of like the BFG. It's like a delete this group of enemies button, so it's useful in certain scenarios. But my personal favorite weapons are the Sika, I think is how it's pronounced, which is, they're like 2 curved swords, so it's dual swords. They're really fast and can stun lock enemies very easily and do pretty good damage. They're not super long range, but they are really quite strong because of how fast they are. They're just fun to use in general. They have a nice rhythm to them, but also their alt fire throws one of them like a boomerang. While it's in the air, you can slash with the other singular sword if you need to, but it will come back to you eventually. This is a big deal because it means it's the game's only ranged option that doesn't use ammo. And then there's the Falx, which is almost necessary in some maps. It is a huge curved greatsword style of weapon that basically ignores shields. Its primary attack is just a nice, relatively fast for how large it is, chop that does good damage, and its secondary fire is a slower, wide swing that is like a big cone, almost like a shotgun sort of effect in front of you. And it's really, really strong, and the fact that it ignores shields entirely makes it really, really useful in certain areas, especially in like Act 2 and 3, where you will sometimes come across really large groups of shielded enemies. It's almost required to get past them. I also like the fact that the game starts out relatively historically grounded, aside from the fact that you're Julius Caesar back from the dead, but the enemies and the weapons and stuff are mostly historically accurate, but then sometimes some more mythological stuff will get mixed in, which is pretty cool. Like, for instance, a Cyclops might show up, or there are also the Archviles. There are these like priest dudes that show up. I'm not entirely sure what they're called, but they're basically Archviles. They fly around, they revive dead enemies pretty much infinitely, and they can teleport all over the place. They don't have an attack, thankfully, but they can teleport really, really rapidly. I should also probably mention that this game is really hard, like extremely difficult. I found this to be super hard. I play a lot of like GZ Doom mods on ultraviolence and stuff, so I'm used to, you know, mean enemy placement and difficult areas and big arenas and stuff, but this game is particularly difficult for me. I think a lot of it is down to the fact that the game calls itself a die and retry shooter, mostly because there are no checkpoints or mid-level saves. You can't quick save or anything, so if you make a mistake, you've got to start the whole level over. I'm not a huge fan of that, to be honest, but I do respect that it's the vision of the developers, and I understand why they did it. Personally, if I'm going to be subjected to trial and error gameplay, I like to be able to get back to the trial after I made the error really fast so I can try again. But having to restart the entire level before I get a second chance at the trial is not the most fun thing. I still prefer to, you know, be able to quick save and try things more rapidly, but that's just a personal preference really, and the fact that these levels are so fast, everything happens really quickly, means that you're probably only gonna lose like 4 or 5 minutes before you can get back to where you were anyway, so it's not a huge deal, but it is something to be aware of. Overall, I think Caesar's Revenge is pretty great. It is a solid old-school shooter, but in the mold of something more melee-focused, and the fact that they have put a lot of effort into the map design and stuff to facilitate this more melee-focused, highly aggressive gameplay shows that they know exactly what they want out of this game and have done a good job of actually providing that style of gameplay. I think its themes and its appearance and everything has a lot of charm. I think it's got some pretty cool atmosphere. I like the distance fog effect. It adds a sort of interesting, dismal, kind of dark revenge atmosphere to the whole thing. And there are also lots of little details that are pretty cool, like a lot of the detail in the environments, the more sort of city environments, just look really good, the way the buildings look and stuff. But also you've got the fact that things like water, any sort of standing water or rivers around the place, if you kill enemies around them and blood gets in the water, it'll actually stain the water more and more dark red as you do it, which is a nice little touch that you usually don't see in games like this. I also just really appreciate how homegrown the game feels, like the fact that they clearly got one of the devs to do the reads for the levels. The level intros have actual voice acting, which sounds good. I like it, and I think it adds to the game a little bit for the fact that it's there, and also the fact that the developers made the sort of thrashy soundtrack as well. It all adds to the sort of homegrown feel of this game. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. It is cheap and cheerful, and it's absolutely worth its asking price. If you're in the mood for a difficult, exacting old school shooter or something a little bit different, then you could do a lot worse. I think it is a really good entry in the genre. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page to Caesar's Revenge. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.